Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, honourable members of Parliament, members of this Justice, Law and Human Rights Committee. Democracy is said to be the fairest form of governance, of coexistence, of blending together shared values amidst different platforms and different ideas. It's not said to be perfect, and no one expects it to be. But it must be fair, and it is fair only to the extent that the government would allow it to be. This session of this subcommittee hearing sits, Mr. Chairman, to hear submissions on the proposed bills to amend the three main electoral legislations prior to the 2022 general elections. Mr. Chairman, the right to vote is a constitutional right. Section 23 of the 2013 Constitution, and under the heading of political rights, each citizen has the right to form and join a political party, participate and recruit members for the party, campaign for their party of choice or candidate of choice. Subsection 2, Mr. Chairman, gives each citizen the right to free, fair and regular election. I start with the constitutional provision because we need to remove the myth, if it exists, that it is the government that gives us an election every 4 years. It may be administratively, but when a right exists under the Constitution, it must be remembered that by design, a constitution isn't a law prescribed by Parliament to bind the people. It is the people saying to Parliament, these are our rights. Now you provide us, by public fund, the opportunity to exercise these rights without encumbrance, without rigidity of law, without impediment, and without inconvenience. The Constitution, Mr. Chairman, is a negative document. The theory behind it is to divide powers to protect our liberty. These liberties, rights, and freedoms are best protected when it is not in the same set of hands, because when powers is contained in one set of hands, or a few, we have tyranny. So we divide powers between the legislators, you, members of Parliament, honourable members of Parliament, you make laws. Then there is the executive arm of the state, represented by the President, who passes them. Then there is the judiciary. They adjudicate complaints between parties based on the laws and interpret them according to the intents of Parliament, not on how they wish to interpret it. If that's not enough to protect citizens from powers in one hand, we add to it by giving ourselves a Bill of Rights to ensure that if the state would one day think it is best to go heavy-handed on its citizens, we will have set ourselves unalienable rights that should ensure our freedom and our liberty at all times. Having an election, Mr. Chairman, and how to have a fair one, accessible, not burdensome or rigid, is not the choice of government. It is the choice of the people. It is the government's role to give them a free and fair election through public funding. The various amendments to the bills that gives additional powers to the supervisor of election is too much in the hands of one public servant. Consider, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, the proposed amendment clause 35 to the Electoral Amendment Bill of 2020. amending Section 144 of the Principal Act. Under the Principal Act, there already is an existing law relating to printing, publishing, or electoral advertising, and notices, etc. The long and short of it, Mr. Chairman, is that if you breach it, you can be prosecuted. There is a statutory defense available, fair enough. Now comes the proposed amendment. And the amendment, it gives the supervisor of election powers to direct a person, a service provider, a political party, to take down any statement or information that he determines may contain false information or to diminish public confidence in the performance of any duty or function of the supervisor and the Electoral Commission. Mr. Chairman, this is a coercive power with a penal consequence, only seen in orders of the courts of Fiji in the hands of one person now. Then the new clause seems to pull wool over our eyes by massaging us, saying, look, don't worry, if you don't agree with his ruling, appeal to the Electoral Commission. But he is in fact the Secretary of the Electoral Commission. By virtue of the office of the Secretary, Mr. Chairman, he processes your appeal against his own decision. And this is the farce that I identify in the proposed bill of Clause 35 of the amendment bill. The former provisions makes it an offense to publish incorrect statements and information that one knowingly makes and knows it to be false. If the supervisor of election isn't happy with my Facebook posting or my tweet, he can refer me to FICAC, and I will be, of course, interviewed and charged. Not that I want to, but at least I get the chance to keep my post in the public domain because my other right, the freedom of speech, and other people's right, the freedom to get information, can still be maintained. For those two rights, mine of speech and others for information, to be vetoed in a minute by someone who thinks it may offend isn't democracy. It's despotic. I would urge this committee not to recommend this change. Remember, too much power in the hands of a few is tyranny. Clause 31, again, gives that extrajudicial powers to the supervisor of election, powers that are exercised without due process of the courts. The proposed bill gives powers to the supervisor of election to remove any material that is in breach of the campaign rules. Who determines that? He does. Who executes that? He does. It doesn't stop there. He can even direct. Who can he direct? Political party or a candidate. That's fair enough. But listen to this, Mr. Chairman. An officer, a police officer, in this instance, is under the direction of the supervisor of election to take down a material that he thinks is not according to the rules. For some light moment, Mr. Chairman, if the police officer happens to be from Namosi, and he is considered a warrior for the Tui Namosi by tradition, and he decides he will not accept what's being directed of him by the supervisor of election. He commits an offense and is liable to a fine of up to $10,000 and or 5 years imprisonment. Mr. Chairman, a police officer is an officer of a disciplined force. His directives are from the commissioner and the rank and file of the Fiji police force above him. The only other way a police officer acts is upon a warrant or an order of the Court of Fiji for him or her to execute. The order is done by a seal of the court. Here, Let's take a scenario. The supervisor of election walks into a town area prior to election and sees a SODELPA banner that he thinks is offensive, probably better than a Fiji First banner, and he directs it to be removed. They should, if they don't, become liable to prosecution for not obeying to a spontaneous order of the supervisor of election on the day in which he decides that advertisement is against the rule. Mr. Chairman, this is a draconian measure. We are living in the 21st century where natural justice is observed and people's right to free and unencumbered election is protected from legislative inroads, such as the consolidation of powers we see is being attempted in these amendments. The power of the registrar of political parties to deregister a party without according natural justice is another form of judge, jury, and executioner. The proposed Clause 9 of the Political Parties Registration, Conduct, Funding and Disclosure Bill of 2020 gives the Registrar of Political Parties the powers to deregister after a 30-day time period of paid non-compliance. You are non-complying, but you're paying for it. The wording must doesn't leave any room for natural justice. It doesn't even leave any room for review by any court of law. Mr. Chairman, when a political party is registered, a minimum of 5,000 people have to sign up. A payment of fees follow. That's in addition to the cost of going out to collect 5,000 signatures. A lot of work is put into preparation for an election, and thousands of dollars, perhaps millions, are spent in campaigns. For a party like SODELPA, enjoying the second most votes in the country's elections with thousands of voters behind it, for one-man band to determine its existence as a party is not only a procedural hypocrisy, it's also criminal. It flies in the face of people's political rights under the Constitution. For a technical breach to cause a deregistration is a charade and an embarrassment to any claim that Fiji is a land of freedom, hope, and glory. The office of the Registrar of Political Parties and the office of the Supervisor of Election, Mr. Chairman, must be distinct and must be held by two different individuals. They must not be the same person. Amendments we would suggest, Mr. Chairman, must be brought to ensure that there is a clear demarcation of the offices, one differently held from the other. It must be so because that distinction of office holders provides to the political parties the comfort of transparency, accountability, and clear demarcation of the roles that are dissimilar and should be separate in nature. The Registrar of Political Parties looks after the Political Parties Act 2013, and the Supervisor of Election should look after the Electoral Act of 2014 and the Voters Registration Act of 2012. Mr. Chairman, those are my contribution to this morning's session, and I will hand over to the General Secretary of the party if the committee pleases to address you further.